If you've been following the Black expat for a while, you might know that Karla Fraser is a familiar voice. She's been writing and contributing to the site for the past 2 years. What you may not know is that I've known Karla for a hot minute. I met her back in 2016 on a trip to Singapore. A colleague of mine knew I was heading to the nation and recommended I meet up with this contact of hers. At the time, Karla, a student affairs professional, was working at a university in Singapore, and we quickly connected on our similar careers in higher ed. And while Qatar was my first time working in education abroad, Karla, I learned, was not new to it at all. After years at working at American institutions domestically, she transitioned her student affairs career to an international one that has taken her to places as different as Dominica, Afghanistan, Niger, and the aforementioned Singapore, just to name a few. It is with that valuable experience and knowledge that Karla launched RoseApple Global, a boutique consulting firm that focuses on offering support to international universities on student affairs protocols, as well as guide professionals who are ready to take their careers overseas. In this episode, Karla will share how her early cross-cultural years set her up for this vibrant career. She describes her purpose and why it's always at the center of her professional choices. She addresses the challenges and also describes why she built RoseApple Global. I always joke that Karla has been everywhere, at least if it's warm. And by the end of this episode, you just might feel the same. Welcome to the Global Chatter. All right, so we're here with the latest episode of the Global Chatter, and I have Karla with me. And I was thinking to myself before this episode, and it's funny because Karla's going to tell you her background and all that stuff. But I was thinking to myself right before this episode, I met Karla probably 5 countries ago in her in her international story. Y'all have heard me talk about Singapore before, how I love Singapore. I'm pretty sure I've said that in an episode. That's where I met Karla. And it's funny to say that because that was about 5 years ago, which is crazy to think about it because she has lived in multiple countries since I saw her. And I remember it was December 2016. I was in Singapore on a holiday, and someone who was a colleague in higher ed, which we're going to get into all of that, connected me to her. And I knew I was going to be in Singapore and said, hey, we should meet up. And I met up with her on the day I was flying back to Qatar. And so it's not really full circle because honestly, y'all, if you listen to the introduction, I talk to her all the time. However, it's part of the circle or the ongoing journey. So Karla, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yes, it has been a long time, but not.
You're right.
5 years seems like a long time, but when you put it in that context, 5 years in several countries, yeah.
No, it was weird because I was thinking to myself, okay, you're currently in Dominican Republic, which we'll get to. But then I had to work backwards. I was like, all right, she was in Dominican Republic, but then she was in Niger. But then I think I can't remember if you were in Bangladesh or if Malaysia was in between that or before that. And then you were, so if wherever Malaysia was, it was there, but but you were in Bangladesh. Yep. And then you were in Singapore. I think I got all the countries right. Was there another country? Did I miss between
there
Singapore?
Is one.
What was that?
So I went from Singapore to Indonesia to Malaysia.
I forgot. Because I think for me, I always, in my mind, when it comes to Indonesia for you, I'm like, well, that's just kind of where you go to recenter and vacate. You know what I mean? Like, I thought of it more as she was vacationing, like, yeah, whatever. She goes to Indonesia all the time. So that's why I think that's why I forgot about it. I did not remember Indonesia. Okay. So really, it was Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Bangladesh, Niger, Dominican Republic. Okay. Well, if anyone sees a running theme, you like hot climates. That's what
that is true.
You know what I think is real interesting, and I know all the places you've been so far, but like what's really interesting is that your international story and so far does not include Europe. Like, I mean, you've been to Europe, but it does not in terms of, oh, you upped and moved to Europe. That wasn't even, which is, I mean, I think that the places you've moved to are really interesting and places that maybe some people don't think about. But yeah, I was like mapping it out. I was like, yeah, she really did kind of avoid Europe. Not avoid it, but you know.
Yeah, I tell people I stay around the equator in between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they even know geography that deep, though. I mean, I know what you're talking about.
That.
I feel like that's so specific. Do you need you need to actually know where those two are? Yeah, but wow. Yeah. So, but let's get into it because I think you have a really interesting story and you know, both you and I connect because we both are higher educators and student affairs professionals. And so I think there's a lot of really great nuances, particularly with your background, because I've had educators before, but they tend to represent the K-12 space, right? When you look at especially the international landscape. I did have Corey, of course, who you know, who we talked about study abroad, but we haven't really had anyone who has worked abroad at the university collegiate level, what we say in the States. And so I think you've got a lot of great gems that are going to help people out. So let's start from the beginning. So I asked this question of everyone, where did your international story begin? So where did you grow up? Did you travel? What's the deal?
So I began in the US, was where I was born. About 9 months later, I ended up in Jamaica as a child and then came back to the US. So I'm a third culture kid, very the same respect that you are. And while I was in my teenage years, I traveled between Canada, the US, and Jamaica. So that's my childhood travel was between those three countries predominantly. And then once I got through college, university, I started venturing out on my own to other places, Mexico, the Caribbean, other Caribbean islands, and eventually ended up in my career being abroad.
Where did you grow up in?
My family's originally from Jamaica. And so that's home base. And I carried that around, and that really has spurred how I am and what I do. And I tell my mother all this all the time, and she disagrees periodically, most of the time, that she gave me a passport at 9 months. And what did you expect me to do after that?
Right. Well, I was going to say, in the US, where did you grow up?
So I grew up around the Chicago area, suburb called Evanston. Most people know it for particularly Northwestern.
Right. No, forget that part. How did I not know that you even grew up in Chicago? Seriously, I talked to you I'm pretty sure I was texting you yesterday. I had no idea you grew up in Chicago.
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Downtown Chicago is where I hung out as a teenager.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Grant Park, Buckingham Fountain, the lakefront, Taste of Chicago. My prom was in the Hilton, downtown Chicago.
I did not know this. Okay. Well, I guess it's like people who meet me all the time and then they go, I listened to some podcast you were on, and I'm like, how did I not know about this information about you? I've known you for years. And I'm like, well, I guess if it has no reason to come up, it's, and I also think with international people, it's really funny, right? Like we get the general, where did you grow up? And it might be like country, but we don't necessarily go into, what part of Sweden or what part of Nigeria necessarily, right?
Exactly.
We're just like, oh yeah, you grew up in whatever. And then we move on to like why you're not living there anymore. Okay, so you grew up, and here, okay, so this is what I do know, because I think this is really interesting. So you grew up in Chicago, obviously grew up at least traveling in North America, which is significant because there are plenty of people who don't necessarily go to Canada or to, at least Jamaica or the Caribbean, even though they're, in the region. So I think that's significant travel. But then you went to college in North Dakota. Is that correct?
I did.
Okay, I feel like that is a cultural shock from Chicago.
It was. I don't like coal. And once I graduated, I never went back. But I also used to go to Canada because the Canadian border was 45 minutes away. So Winnipeg was another place that I used to hang out in my college days. So this international thing has been going, in all kinds of circles throughout the entire time of my life.
So what did you study in college?
So I have a degree. My undergrad is in history and political science. And then I went to grad school in Ohio, and Southern Ohio, and got a degree in international affairs, focusing on Latin America and a little bit of the Caribbean.
What did you think you were going to do? Because I always think it's real interesting when I talk to anyone. I mean, I love talking about careers in general, but when people get these degrees, what did you sort of envision you were going to do with it?
So my story of education is I wanted to go to law school, and the LSAT and I were not friends. Took it 3 times. We were not friends. And that led me to after my first time going to get my master's degree. And my philosophy really after my master's degree was to go work for a multinational. NAFTA, this now dates me, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was in place when I came out of university. And I was like, oh, this is great. My degree is international affairs. It's Latin America. I can go work for NAFTA and NAFTA related things. No, while I was in grad school, I got into higher education and became a hall director. And that became my trajectory. But in my dream days of being young and high school and even part of college, wanting to go to law school, I used to say to people, I wanted to be the next Madeleine Albright. Because to me, I really admired a woman being Secretary of State and diplomacy and all of that. And so, I just took it a different route.
And the reason I do ask that question is because what I think is really great is to see the different routes that take people international, right? That you can have a particular idea or plan and maybe you have to pivot, right? And here's the funny part. You're at least the second person I've had who said the LSAT situation, like something happened and they were not going to law school. Or in that case, maybe they didn't complete it, but you still found a way to go international. Now, but let's backtrack it. You were a hall director, which if you're not in higher ed, look, I feel like there's so many people I know who get into higher ed because somehow they got through residential life, right? As we call it. So res life, you somehow got in that way. I think it's interesting now because we see the rise of higher education admin degrees and whatnot. There's a whole generation of people that got into higher ed who you got a job in college, you got some kind of, you know what I mean? I feel like that's the bigger story of more people, even though we see it more professionalized now. You just got this job because you needed a job to pay bills or housing or food. And then all of a sudden you're in student affairs.
That is so true. And typically it starts with being a resident assistant, being that peer leader, peer educator on the floor. And then you're like, oh, I can do this as a hall director. And then the next thing you know, you're a director of residence life, 10 years later.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking about my sophomore year college roommate where she got, I forgot it was something in res life where it's one of those things where there was no competition for the job. She just put her hat in the ring, and it's been some years later. She is still in student affairs and is very much in residential stuff at a very large university. I just thought to myself, it wasn't because she was trying to study this. It was just, we were sophomores and something opened up, and then she ended up getting a master's in higher ed because she's like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then I think she met her husband who was also doing, like, it's just this whole trajectory. Yeah. So you were in RA, obviously, and that's only for a specific amount of time. What were the next roles you kind of transitioned to while you were stateside?
So I went from being an assistant hall director while I was in grad school. And then my first full-time job out of grad school was being a full-time hall director. And so I did the full-time hall director at a couple different schools, Illinois, Washington State, took a dip into what was known as minority affairs back then. Just not, the DEI space was really not, it was not for me. I liked it. It was good, but it was not I didn't have that passion. So I went back into higher ed in Ohio, this time in Northern Ohio, in Akron area. And then just continued that trajectory. Took a stint out and become a corporate conference planner. So I did do a career change for a moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I think because DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, et cetera, is like the hot topic now. I think many of us remember when it wasn't. and remember when programs were not even as nearly fleshed out as they are now.
And it was difficult.
Yes.
And it wasn't funded. And you were the pariah on campus. And why were you doing this? And
oh my gosh. It is like night and day from, I am at, I work at the institution I was an undergrad at, and just the level of resources and conversation now. I remember being a student, and I was obviously a minority student. None of this existed. I mean, there was some stuff, but it was like not to this level. So I could imagine, at least early on in your career, even this whole conversation about DEI and what it looked like probably looked very different. And I'd love, as we get further down and we take your career international, really talk about what those things look like in an international space. And so, all right. So at this point, you've worked at a couple of colleges in the United States. You took a dip out into the corporate world. How long were you in the corporate world?
2 years.
Okay. I mean, that's not bad. You say it like, I feel like we're seeing the reverse right now where people are like, let me go to the corporate space. Let me hop out of ed. But that's not for this podcast. That's for other reasons. Okay. So you're in for 2 years. You came back. What did you come back into Res Life when you rejoined?
I did.
Okay. So you did Res Life for how many years? That's actually impressive. How long did you do it for?
Yes, my first job abroad was Res Life as well. So I've done Res Life for at least half of my career.
If y'all don't work in student affairs, you have to understand there are just some areas where I could not. I was talking to some colleagues and we were talking about Res Life, and I was like, nope, I can't. These people's children in dorm rooms, and live and learn communities. And I lived in dorm rooms and I know what was going on. I'm like, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with that. Let me tell you the two. I'll tell you right now, the two areas of higher ed, in student affairs especially, I'm staying away from. I know
what the other one is.
Do you?
Conduct.
No, not even. Although that could be. No, I actually would deal with conduct. It's not conduct. You know what it is? It's just, let me tell you, the other area I refuse to touch. Greek life.
Oh, okay.
I
can see that.
Nope.
I can see that.
I am lawsuit averse. So yes. Anyway, carry on. So
I can see that. No, I get the Greek life. I've not touched Greek life at all in any part of my career.
Right.
So yes, I get it. No, conduct is mine. I mean, I do fine at conduct. I don't have any challenges, but it's not my favorite area. What I say about residence life, and I think this is why one of the reasons why people stay in it very long, it is a microcosm of the larger student affairs division.
Okay.
The residence halls have everything that the bigger student affairs has in it. And we do all of it. We do programming. We do conduct. Yes, we deal with, wellness. We do all of this stuff within the residence hall system that is this bigger picture of student affairs. And I think that's that's why you can move around. We do hiring, we do training, yeah. So it can give you longevity. You don't ever have to leave residence life.
And yet I have no desire to ever go near it. Because once again, people's children. No, so, okay, but so you said something that's kind of triggered me because I didn't realize that this was what took you abroad. So
yes.
At what point did you decide I'm going to take my career abroad? And how was that? What was the process and where did you go?
So I don't necessarily know that there was a specific point. It's always been in the back of my head. That's why I got my international affairs degree. It's why I traveled, was I wanted to live and work abroad. And through my time working in the US, especially in my later years, i.e. when I worked at North Carolina State when I was where you are, mm-hmm. I really started to heavily apply to whatever international positions I saw available. Because I was like, I want to go work in student affairs abroad. Mm-hmm. This is now my career path. And I did so. And then I got a 3 a.m. phone call mm-hmm. for a position I had applied for that I forgot about. Mm-hmm. And they woke me up and I was like, what? Hello? And the woman on the other line says, oh, did we wake you? I said, yes, it's like 3. I looked at the clock, 3 a.m. She goes, oh, sorry. Can we call you back in like 3-4 hours? I was like, yes, please. Because she said, we're calling from the UAE. You applied for this job several months ago. And I was like, oh my gosh.
Wow.
And so literally fast forward, there was no Zoom back then. Mm-hmm. So I actually had to go to a video conferencing center mm-hmm. where they would set up the video conference link and I would sit in the room and talk to the folks in the UAE 14 years ago, by the way.
Yeah.
And interviewed in the room. There were 6 or 7 other people on the other end. It was just me. And another month after that, I got a call that says, hey, we want to hire you. And the process started. And so Noah, what I say to people is I took my career abroad. I went from a residence life position in the United States to a residence life position in the UAE.
I think that's a really key distinction because, one of the things, obviously, when people are thinking about going abroad, you're obviously thinking the finances, you're thinking about how you're going to support yourself, and you're thinking about your career. And depending on, and of course, we're talking about the context of higher ed with your career, but depending on what your individual career is, you may have to do that level of proactive work because there may not necessarily be mechanisms where, some fields are a little bit more established, right? So I think medicine's a great example, right? Where mm-hmm. every country tends to have their rules and regulations and you can kind of figure out, will your skill set, will your papers, will your documents be accepted, right? I think that education to a certain degree at the K-12 primary, secondary level or teaching English is a little bit like that. But then there are many areas, including higher ed, and you and I've discussed this quite frequently,
marketing.
Where you have to advocate for what it is that you're looking for. And so when like this opportunity, in my mind, I have a couple of places where I would think of where to look. How did you actually start your search? Like, did you go to particular websites? Did you go by country? Like, how did you even I know you'd forgotten about it, but how did you even know that there was an opportunity at this university in the UAE?
So the 2 primary places that I had looked during this time period was the Chronicle of Higher Ed, mm-hmm. Which, has a job section. And that's one of the primary places. Many international schools, especially high tier schools abroad, will list there. The other place is higheredjobs.com, mm-hmm. where right now, if you go on that website, there's roughly 800 jobs abroad. Mm-hmm. between administration and faculty, mm-hmm. Both remote, both in person. And so those are the 2 primary places that I looked when I started this process mm-hmm. to live and work abroad. I can't tell you exactly where I found my initial job, but I know it was one of those two places.
So really, I mean, I think to reiterate for the folks who are listening is you started with the places where you would look for jobs in your field anyway, and then looked and found the international component because they had already teased out, and I know they do it now, at least a better job, but they teased out, okay, these are internationally based jobs. These are US based or Canada based or North America based jobs, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And so where did you go to Abu Dhabi, or did you go to Dubai, or did you go to somewhere else in the UAE?
Neither Abu Dhabi or Dubai. I went to Al Ain.
You know what? And it was on my brain. And as I was saying it, I was like, you know what? Honestly, there are more cities because it's the United Arab Emirates, right? So it's like, but of course, Abu Dhabi and Dubai are the first ones. Okay. Did you even, like, I like to ask people this, especially for like their first international posting. Did you even conceptualize like what this experience would look like? Like, had you even been to the Gulf at that point? Did you know what to expect? No. Okay. Yeah. You're like me. When you get there, it's like when you first figure it all out. Right.
Right. Exactly. No, I had just done a lot of reading about the UAE and the Gulf in general. Of course, you know, the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, all of that stuff had happened. I had that perspective, but then I went and read to understand the country I was moving into. One of the things I did after I got hired, my poor supervisor, and she's literally a friend now, a mentor, and one of my biggest advocates. I sent her probably 20 to 30 questions after I accepted the job. I said, hi, I need to know all these things.
Your supervisor in UAE?
Yes, this was to my supervisor.
Very cool.
And she patiently wrote back and, you know, shared what she knew. She said I needed to get other answers from other people. She then connected me with another colleague who was American Sudanese, but she was the other woman of color on the staff. And so she and I had a conversation. And I was like, okay, I think I can do this. And I went through the process and got on the plane.
No, and that's so good of her. Like and I'm going to talk a little bit about that after the break, because I think there are questions that people need to ask when they're going into opportunities. And when I had Ryan Haynes on, and he's in the K-12 level, we talked about like the questions that him and his wife is, she's white, he's African-American, he's a CCK, but we talked about questions that they ask about understanding, you know, the country, the culture, whatever, you know, in a lot of contexts before they get there. And so it's really interesting to hear you, of course, talk about that going into the UAE and really looking at that a higher ed context. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. And then when we're going to come back, we're going to pick up on living in UAE and then all the really funky places she's lived afterwards. I say funky, but like, you know, they're all different, especially Afghanistan. So we'll be right back. All right, so we are back. And as you recall before the break, Karla had just walked us into her opportunity in UAE. And so she was talking a little bit about how her supervisor in the UAE was responding to these 30 questions that she asked, which, I mean, I think it's interesting to ask them after you accept. Sometimes you may want to ask the questions before you accept, but we all do what we're going to do. And so how long were you in the UAE for?
2 years.
Okay. So at this point, you had been working in res life. You'd worked in higher ed extensively. Obviously, you took a dip out, went to corporate and came back. Now you're in this institution, the UAE. How was your role, or how was your job different than maybe in the US?
I think the biggest difference was I was in a senior level. So my career not only took me abroad, but it also took me into a significant promotion. So career advancement is one of the things that you can do when you move abroad. So I was running a residence life department of roughly 9,000 plus beds, about 9,500 plus students in housing, predominantly females. Food service, medical care was under me, and all of that. So, room assignments, managing staff. And my job was really to help the institution at the time transition to being more student focused, student centered in their residential living space. So I literally built a new resident assistant program, a new resident director program, moving it away from some of the more stringency and being more student focused. But again, keeping the cultural context in place. This is the UAE. It's an Islamic country. There are certain things that are within the context that we need to respect and understand. And so I was learning those things at the same time, trying to transform using international standards from ACUHOI and NASPA and things of this nature to build a transition and a new program with the team on the ground. Most of my staff were a mixture of Emiratis, other nationalities, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine. There's lots of Egyptians, I remember. But yeah, definitely a mix on the ground between the male and female staff that helped manage the student housing area. And then definitely some of my leaders were Emirati nationals.
When I went to Qatar, I had a similar experience in that it's really interesting taking what you've done and what you've known kind of from a Western context and then tweak it to apply, in that case, to a Gulf nation and to their cultural context. Was this a university that had an American style curriculum, a Western style curriculum, or what was there, or were they just an Emirati university that was building out, developing their student affairs space?
So this was a national university. It is the flagship university of the UAE higher ed system. So the federal system of universities have three branches. There was the flagship, there was an in-between, and then there was a community college system. So I was at the flagship university for the federal system. So the other school was already ahead of the game. So the national university was actually playing catch up. And then the community college system, they were here and there, depending on the school and where they were located, were trying to do a bit of this. So the whole federal system was trying to be more student centric.
So I didn't realize this because I know you have certainly worked at universities that had adopted a more hybrid or an American style or Western style system. I didn't realize that this was the national Emirati, part of the Emirati system. And so were you having any experiences around culture shock kind of moving to the Gulf? Because if we look at your travels, right? You'd been in predominantly North America, right? Yeah, I mean, you'd gone to the Caribbean, which is still part of the Americas. But, I know my own experiences going there, but was there at least when you first got there, were there some points where you're like, oh my gosh, this is really different?
Yes, I would say yes. I had never traveled to the Gulf. Most of my travels prior to moving abroad had been, adding Europe to that. I had been to Europe, but I'd never been to the Gulf region. And so there were definitely, I think the biggest surprise that came to me was during Ramadan. And my first Ramadan there in the UAE, the way I explained it is night became day and day became night in the terms of activities of the country. Right. So during the day, it was quiet. All the shops were closed. The restaurants were closed. You barely found any cars on the streets. Work hours were cut down to about 4 or 5. And then once everyone broke fast, usually between 6 and 7-ish, depending on the time, the sunset, the place became lively. Like the malls were filled. Everyone was out to eating dinner. The malls were open until 2, 3 in the morning, and everything that you would normally do in the middle of the day started to happen from about 7 p.m. until about 3 in the morning. And that was a real eye opener for me. I was like, wow. And literally that was my reaction. Outside of that, I found my colleagues very friendly, very warm. I got invited to weddings in people's houses, what is known as the Emirati hospitality, or, the Gulf has a warm hospitality in general. So I don't know that anything was a huge shock. I did truly start to understand my passport privilege, holding a U.S. passport, and what that meant. And in both a positive and a negative way. But I think those were the things that really came to play for me.
What month did you land in the UAE?
I landed in October? No, September. It was the end of Eid. The first Eid had just happened. So Ramadan I missed Ramadan. The first Eid had happened. I was there for the second Eid. And then I spent my next year, I had my first Ramadan.
I landed like September 1st or whatever. I have never been so hot in my life.
Like a story for you.
And everyone who knows me knows I once again hang out in warm climates, although lately I've been a little bit obsessed with cold climates. I don't know what's happening. I'm watching all these shows on people living in Alaska and Yukon, and like remote parts of Canada. And I'm like, this is kind of fascinating. It's really weird, actually. But I landed, it was not, because I left the States August 31st. I landed and I have lived I lived in, sub-Saharan Africa. I lived in New Mexico in the desert part of it. I've lived in the American South. Like I've been to like South America. There's like, I have never been so hot in my life. Like they warned me, they're like, okay, when the doors open.
Oh, yes.
And he was just like, oh my gosh. Muhammad looked at me. He was like, ma'am, you need to get ready. And I said, what are you talking about? And I was like, I've never been hot like that in my life.
The heat it does hit you.
Whew,
so the funny story I have about the heat is I knew that this was a hot climate. So I had lots of sandals. And so I could wear sandals to work as long as they were appropriate. I had lots of sandals. And so one day wore a sandal to work. I was walking out, so I had a little bit to walk to my car. And by the time I got to my car, the sole of my shoes was behind me about, 3-5 steps. The sidewalk was so hot that the glue melted off. And my sole of my shoes was behind me.
I mean, this is so.
And I literally, I didn't know if I should laugh or I should cry. And I was like, okay. I literally went to my apartment, drove home, went to my apartment, and literally got online and started to look for thick sole shoes. And I'm not plugging any particular brand, but this particular brand became my favorite. Easy Spirit, because they had the thicker soles on their sandals and they were cute. They were work related. And I think I bought like 7 or 8 pairs of Easy Spirit shoes and had them sent to me because I could feel the heat through the bottom of my feet.
I could never. I mean, it's hot. Like, I don't, you know how people get into these dumb conversations over humidity versus dry heat? When it's like
It
hot
doesn't
and there are no
matter.
trees, it doesn't matter. It's just
It doesn't
hot.
matter.
It's so hot. I think I screenshotted the temperature on my phone. I screenshotted it and I put it up on Facebook that year or whatever the day I would left. And people just looked at it like, what is that? I'm like, I am sitting next to the sun, it feels like right now. It is so hot. And I mean, I think for me, it was just, there were parts of Qatar that reminded me of Northern Cameroon, which is Sahel, Sahara culture.
Yep.
You know, we've got Fulani tribes and whatnot. So there was some, and Cameroon has a significant Muslim population, right? So none of the call to prayers and all of that affected me one way or the other, just because I'd grown up hearing that. But it was, I think it was the lack of trees that were indigenous, because any trees that I saw in Qatar were brought in for the most part from somewhere. And then I've been to Abu Dhabi and I'm like, these trees are not from the UAE. Are these palm trees? Where are these trees from? And so I think it was just like little funny things for me that was so different, but it always comes back to the heat. And you're right. Nobody in their right mind is going to be walking around during the day anyway, because it's so hot. And then to be fair, when I lived in New Mexico, nobody was walking around during the day certain months either, because desert, right? But in the evening, though, everybody's out. And so that makes absolute sense. And so you were there for 2 years. And I always, you know, and I'm glad you talked about the hospitality, because, you know, sometimes people ask, well, how was your experience as a woman? How's your experience as someone who's not Muslim? How's your experience as all these things? And I would imagine, I mean, I've been to the UAE, kind of similar to Qatar. You didn't have to cover, I assume.
I did not.
That's always a question. That's the number one question I think people ask all the time.
I will clarify, though. I lived in Al Ain, which is a little bit more conservative than Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Mm-hmm. And again, within context, this was 14 years ago. So it's definitely still more conservative than it is today. Now, I remember my dress code was elbows covered, knees covered.
Yeah.
So whatever my clothes was, whether it was casual or business, my knees had to be covered even when I was sitting, and my elbows had to be covered. So I had clothes that fit that for both personal, social life and my office wear. But other than that, I did not have to cover. I did have to cover once because I went to a specific sheikh event where women, everyone in the room that was a female had to cover, no matter who you were. This was the requirement for this particular event. But outside of that, no.
Yeah, I mean, same. I wore a lot of dresses because it was hot.
Yes.
To be honest,
dresses were your best friends.
You wanted things that air could move between. So dresses are the thing.
By the way, that's why they wear abayas.
Right. Well, that's why men also wear thopes. Like, seriously, like you need the air moving. I mean, it makes sense. But here's the thing. I also wore a ton of cardigans because you would be in buildings and it would get cold,
freezing
because it was so hot outside. And so, same. I did not wear every sleeveless dress I had a cardigan that matched with it, right? Mm-hmm. So that I would always be covered. I always made sure my knees were covered. But beyond that, it wasn't, I know for me, it wasn't really disruptive, but I know this often tends to be the questions people ask. They're like, oh, living in those areas, did you have to cover? And I'm like, I mean, unless it was something like you talked about where the circumstance of the situation asked for it, there wasn't an expectation. There was just more of an expectation that, you just wouldn't show certain body parts,
right?
Because that's everybody, right? So don't show certain body parts. And that was that. So here's the thing. You were in UAE for 2 years.
Yep.
Is this when you then from UAE, is that when you went to Afghanistan?
So from UAE, I came back home for 2 years. So I repatriated for 2 years in the
Interesting.
middle of the economic downturn, as it was labeled in the United States.
Wow.
And so partway through that, I worked in Nebraska in the middle of the cornfields. It was an interesting experience. Senior leadership position at a small state school there. And from Nebraska, I then hopped out of the United States again and went to Afghanistan.
So how did that opportunity come up? Was it the same process as when you were looking for the UAE position, or was that something that came on your radar through a different means?
It was through a similar process. Now, the Afghanistan position has a unique story. In 2011, I applied for that position and was offered the position. I was ready to go to Afghanistan. And literally, I needed to give my acceptance. Yes, I'm coming. And literally the day before I was supposed to give my acceptance, there was a major incident in Kabul where I was going. And it was the international hotel there had been attacked. And I said to myself, if they attack the international hotel, what am I doing there?
Right.
Now, that logic doesn't make sense because that's where they're going to attack. But in my mind back then, thinking about this, yeah. So I literally turned down the job in 2011. Took the job in Nebraska in 2011. It's rural Nebraska. I didn't feel the job was great, but it was not for me. And the same position came up open again. And in my mind, I was like, okay, that's just speaking to me. Like, Karla, you missed it. Let me give it to you again.
Okay.
So I literally reapplied. Actually, I didn't reapply. I actually sent an email to the person who had hired me before. It says, hey, I saw this open again. Would you reconsider me? I'm really ready to come this time, yada, yada, yada. So they wrote me back, asked me a couple questions. I answered them, and literally I accepted and decided to go. So I left in 2012.
So can I ask a question? Because I'm sure some people are wondering this. What was the appeal to go to Kabul, Afghanistan for you at that stage of your career?
The appeal was the university. This was an American-style university in Afghanistan, co-ed. It is a U.S.-funded project. One of the few that, all you heard about was the war and the terror groups. But this was a bright spot. This was women and young men and women getting an education, U.S. style, in the middle of the capital city. And I follow positions and institutions based on my purpose. And my purpose is really to share American style education to others in countries where it is not likely their students can afford or will get the opportunity to come to the United States for an education. And so I went, and I felt comfortable going the second time around. My faith was with me, and I said, that's it.
So I'm sure as you are thinking you're going to Afghanistan, family and friends are thinking,
what is wrong with me?
You are neither soldier nor like, why are you going to Afghanistan? Yeah, well.
Right, exactly. And I said it's for education. Education, in the words of Nelson Mandela, education's a weapon. So I'm about to provide the best one to these students.
So, okay. Because you are probably the only person I've had thus far. I'm thinking, no, I've had a couple of people go to Afghanistan. So what would you like to dispel? Because I'm sure much of the interactions and information that people have about Afghanistan, if they don't live in the region, is definitely through the news, right? and obviously through the lens
Right.
of the conflict, which I think technically just officially ended. I mean, we don't have troops there anymore, so yeah. But
Yes.
what
So yes.
what do you think are some of the myths that people just misunderstand about that country?
I think one of the things is that the countries, they have a knowledge base that has long-standing history of education and a long-standing history of being in the forefront of many things. Now, the wars that have happened with Russia, the United States, and various allies have disrupted that in many ways. But what I want to say is that they're some of the most resilient people that I have ever met. I had students who literally said, Miss, I'm here at this university, and these are female students, at the risk of me getting acid in my face or at the risk of being injured, because I want to rebuild my country, because I want to see a new Afghanistan, a different Afghanistan. I want to see girls going to school. Now, I will say that while I was there, I was in a period of what I would consider, not politically deemed in any way, this is just my opinion, of relative calm. It doesn't mean that things didn't happen. Mm-hmm. It meant that it was calm enough that we were not in lockdown. And I know lockdown's used for the pandemic these days, but it's typically used in countries that are at political risk as well. So I was able to go out and about. So I went out to eat all the time, particularly on my weekends, to the Korean restaurant or the Italian or, the French restaurant. One of my favorite places was to go to one of the French restaurants that had an outdoor rose garden. Yes, roses. Roses are one of the most amazing things in Afghanistan. They grow everywhere and they're absolutely beautiful. Shameless plug is that if you go to my website, I wrote about my experience in Afghanistan and I have pictures of the roses on my story. But the other thing was I had some amazing fruits, watermelon, the sweetest pomegranates I've eaten till this day. The roadside, we would stop and get bread, fresh baked naan type bread. People were very warm and friendly. It doesn't mean that there weren't threats. My biggest threat or the biggest fear I had wasn't being bombed or shot. It was about being kidnapped, because then I became a prisoner of war and, ransom and would be mistreated and all the things that may go with being in captivity. But that risk was worth it to see and be able to teach some of the students I did, because I was teaching first year experience and be an academic advisor. And the skills I gained by just being in Afghanistan that I probably would not have gotten elsewhere, because getting into academic side and academic advising and teaching is not always easy, but I was able to do that. So those are the things I want to just talk about. It's not that there wasn't threat, but I was in a point where I was still able to go within the city. I couldn't travel outside of Kabul. Our institution had stopped that travel because various parts that we were originally, people who were in the university before could go, were increasingly under threat. So I during my time there, I wasn't able to travel out, but I did travel within the city and around, and most of it was all about food.
I think, and this isn't limited to Afghanistan, but obviously with the recent final withdrawal of the U.S., at least military presence, I think when you've been an expat and you've traveled and you know places and you see places, it's always something to sort of see them on the news when you have experienced a place. And, and and it's always an interesting question, because I've asked this of folks who have come from places and lived in places where then there were uprisings and there was conflicts and there was, a shifting politically or militarily. I can imagine for you, seeing kind of the wind down in August, there is some emotional tie for you, because that's somewhere that you actually know and have lived and you did life with, right? I think if you watch the news or kind of follow social media, for example, people who are in the military who'd been, who'd served and whatnot, there's an emotional tie, having been in those countries. And so it's interesting to always hear from folks who've actually experienced a place kind of talk about it, because these are the things that we would never hear, right? I don't know if anyone who hadn't actually been there could talk about the hospitality of people, or talk about the fruit, right? Or talk about, when you said, yeah, there was this Korean restaurant, my brain was not thinking she's in Kabul and would get Korean food. Shout out to the Korean, the Korean entrepreneur that was like, let me go ahead and make this restaurant happen. But you know what I mean? I think this is why it's so interesting to hear people's stories, because it colors in the gray. It colors in the gray for us so often. And so how long were you in Afghanistan?
Just under a year and a half. And I tell people I would have stayed longer, except that with two friends, acquaintances, one from US military, one from British military, said, look, the upcoming election's happening, and things are going to get rougher going into the election, right before the election. And that was very true. So I left in September. The election was held, I think it was that following March. But that leading up to the end of the year, the beginning of the year was really tough on the country. There was lots and lots of incidents within the city and around the country in general, leading into the presidential election, of which the president who just went into exile was the person who was elected.
Right. Right. I was randomly thinking the other day, do we know where he is currently? But I imagine his safety, and we don't want to get into all of that. But for his safety, he wisely told nobody when he pieced out and stayed all of 2 seconds in Tajikistan, and then was out of Tajikistan. And I was like, yeah, I don't know where he's going, but it ain't to Afghanistan. So it is. Right. It is what it is. So, I mean, here's the thing. Since Afghanistan, right? You went to Singapore next. Is that right?
No.
Dominica. Okay. I was like, I know you went to the Caribbean. But yes. But your higher ed career has continued since that's been the thread. My question is that you've been like, for people who are thinking about this type of work, right? What are the things that you're seeing that folks really need to consider? Because, and they would have heard this in the intro, you have your own consulting practice with RoseApple Global, where you are certainly, working both with individuals and groups and organizations as far as student affair practices and work is concerned. What are the things that you're sort of seeing? Like, what are some of the common threads in terms of issues when it comes to working in these institutions, whether they are Western style or they're local style, as a student affairs professional?
I think the thing that you have to be cognizant of, and I'm going to say it again, is you have to make sure that you're understanding the cultural context of the country, the institution, and what you are bringing. Those things have to blend together in order for you to do your best work. That is literally it. And you can find yourself misaligned at institutions that is going one way and you're going the other way. And it does happen, but if you're being very diligent, then you can still do good work for the students of the institution, leave an impact on staff and staff development. That is a huge area. Student affairs is a U.S. philosophical, theoretical framework. Canada has taken it on significantly, parts of Europe, but the rest of the world really hasn't. They're just now coming into being student-centered, student-focused, student-centric. So taking that student affairs knowledge that you have from the US and Canada to other places in the world, they're wanting that, but they're wanting it within their context, and you need to think about that. We have known that technology was always going to be part of higher education. COVID has told us it's now. And so knowing the technology and the skills behind online, virtual, hybrid, blended learning will be an important part if you're going to go into higher ed moving forward. Another thing, entrepreneurship and being innovative in those spaces is part of what's happening around the world, especially on the continent of Africa, in Southern and Southeast Asia, because these economies don't have what it takes to sustain a large employment without a huge entrepreneurship base. So again, making sure that your framework and your mind's around that. These are the three big things I can think of to tell you, if you want to go work in higher ed abroad, these are the things that you need to be thinking about.
I mean, you're right, because we talk about this all the time. People want this. I mean, and it's true. Student affairs really is an North American concept, right? And then I think if you're making that transition to working internationally, that's where having that cultural competency and willingness to say, okay, how can I take what my knowledge and expertise is and frame it and phrase it in a way that works in a Singapore where you've been, a Niger where you've been, an Afghanistan where you've been. Because I think that's for all of us really, is that often there's a way we are trained and we know how to do our jobs in our home countries. But then when you decide to be an expat and go abroad, you have to figure out how to take the expertise, but let it be flexible enough so that it can be adaptable and workable in a new country.
Yes.
And I think that's something you've done really well. I mean, honestly, you've been to so many places. I can't go down the list, but even I think you would even say, even in the US, you've worked at a lot of institutions and had to kind of adjust, whether it was a small, private, large state, somewhere in between urban, rural. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You still have to do that in the US. And there is regions in the United States, and regionally there are things and nuances you have to manage as well. Abroad, and depending on the country you're in, you may also have a language component to contend with when you are working and translating that knowledge that you were bringing, that expertise you're bringing it into another language, and the context that the language may have that may not completely translate to what you're doing.
So as we start to wind down, there's one thing I definitely want you to address and answer, because I know that this is always a common question and I know you get it. If an individual is really thinking about going into higher ed abroad, so international ed, taking their expertise and whether staff or faculty, and want to go outside of their home country, what are a couple of things or pieces of advice you would give in terms of how someone can start that search or get their career going?
Sure. I think first thing, know your purpose. Know why you want to take your career abroad in higher education. If you can figure out that purpose personally and professionally, then that helps you drive to the next piece, which is making sure that your credentials, your resume, your cover letter, and your LinkedIn profile are up to date and speak to the fact that you want to go abroad. When you are at the table, you want to make sure that whoever is looking at those documents can say, oh, you know what? Yes, she's from Georgia, but oh, I see that she has an interest in being abroad. Not that your documents are very US centric and US focused. You have to demonstrate that to them, that you're willing to come. And then you'd start to get into your job search and, looking in the right places, making the right connections, the networking. LinkedIn's great for that. The student affairs conferences, both the ones that are here in the US and abroad, are great for that. And now you can attend a lot of student affairs conferences that are international because we're virtual. So take on those opportunities. And then apply. Now, I will tell you that unlike the K through 12 system where there are search companies and research recruitment companies, higher ed doesn't have that. So this is very much an individual search that you will end up doing and applying. Sometimes it will be easy as sending a resume and a cover letter to an email. Sometimes it will be an online process where you have to fill out a couple questions and attach things. And sometimes it will be a longer online process where you do have to fill everything in and then still attach. So it may vary. Realize that you will have interviews. Your interviews will 98% be virtual. Unless you're going for a VP, dean position, that's the only time you may get flown to the country for a visit. But your interviews are going to be all virtual. So just be prepared for that. Be prepared for sitting on the Zoom calls like you do now and interviewing. And you may have multiple over a short period of time. And then be prepared for the transition. This is the thing I think people often forget when they're going abroad. It's great to get the job, but how are you planning after you get the job for your cultural adjustment and coping skills? Don't forget that. Do the homework and make sure that it won't be perfect, but have some coping skills for those first few months. Culture shock is real. So those are kind of my tips of laying out the pathway for you.
No, and those are great tips. I mean, I think a good number of them apply whether or not it is higher ed that you're looking at, because I guess in the COVID and post-COVID era, a lot of things right now are virtual, the hiring process, and you may not get to go to the country before you start your job, right? And that's been the way for a lot of things. And so, but I do like the fact that you mentioned that, because unless they are flying in every candidate, which most people are not, you need to expect that you're not going to see the country, see the buildings. I mean, they may walk around with an iPad and give you a visual tour if you're lucky, but you're not going to have that. So, but Karla, where can where can everyone find you? I know we're going to have it in the show notes, but I also like people to kind of shout out where is the easiest ways to find them. So where's the easiest way for people to find you if they want to talk more?
So you want to talk more? Find me on LinkedIn. I'm there. I'm active. I'm actively writing about higher ed and expat life. Find me on my IG page, RoseApple RoseApple.global. On LinkedIn, just search me under Karla Fraser or search RoseApple Global. But I'm across all social media. So you can find me on Pinterest. You can find me on Facebook as well. But IG and LinkedIn are the places you can easiest catch up with me. Plus my website.
I was on something and someone was like, yeah, I'm even on Pinterest. And I was like, Pinterest? I mean, I'm there, but it's not usually the place where people I interview are, not for like their businesses or something. And it was just super funny. And it was someone I didn't expect either. They're like, yeah, we even got an active Pinterest. And I was like, really? I mean, Truly, Pinterest is a great way for businesses if you can figure out how to make it work. I think the challenge is that you can make it work, but as your audience on Pinterest, that's just been me. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Good for you for being on Pinterest, though. We will have all of the links up on our site. So it'll be when this goes live, or obviously when y'all are hearing it, it is live. So we will have all the links available also in the show notes. And I always say this jokingly, but it's true. If you're trying to find someone and you can't find them, just follow us on social media and go through our list. The person is probably there because we follow often the people who are on the show, or I'm not going to encourage you to message us because that's just, I don't need those emails. So read the show notes all. But Karla, thank you so much for joining on the chatter. It's, I always like hearing your insight, especially as someone who's been a long-term expat, and truthfully, you've been in so many different environments that I think your expertise and knowledge is so truly valuable.
Amanda, it's always great. And it's been great that you've created the Global Chatter. And, with my almost 10 years abroad consecutively now, this is definitely an experience that I appreciate you sharing with others.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm definitely, I'm sure I said this in the intro, but I'm going to say it again. Karla's been a longtime contributor of the Black Expat as well. And so if you haven't had a chance, she gives really good advice in her articles that she's written for the Black Expat. So you can just go on our site and search for that. We'll have a couple links to some of them in the various mediums where you listen to this podcast. But thank you all once again for listening to the Global Chatter. You can find us in all the locations that you can imagine, including Facebook and the website, theblackexpat.com. We will catch you next time.